There are 50 states in the United States, and that's just how it is, and it feels like it's always been that way. But that's not true. At one point, America was adding new states quite often. In 1850, the United States found itself with a bunch of new land, and they had to deal with it. We're going to explain how the US did that, but first, let's add some context. Young America didn't always span from sea to shining sea. America used to be a nation bound to the Atlantic coast, but there was always a desire to expand westward. American expansion was pretty constant at the beginning of its history, but there were always obstacles. In the 1840s, the US ran up against a very big obstacle: Mexico. So the land out here was controlled by Mexico, but that didn't really stop Americans from moving west. Mexico welcomed settlers into their state of Texas to solidify their land claims there and bolster their economy. The plan backfired because the new American settlers weren't too interested in becoming Mexican. In 1836, they successfully rebelled against Mexico. This rebellion played right into the hands of expansionist Democrats, who saw an opportunity to annex Texas bloodlessly. In 1845, after 10 years of an independent Texas, President James K. Polk welcomed Texas into the US as a new state. For background, James K. Polk was the 11th President of the United States and was essentially an empire builder. Not everyone in the US was an expansionist, and many people opposed the imperial ambitions of people like James K. Polk, but with Polk in office, the US certainly acted like any other imperial power. As soon as Polk had entered office, he had his eyes set on the annexation of land all the way to the Pacific Ocean. He probably would have preferred to purchase the land from Mexico without a war, but once Mexico rejected propositions to purchase the land, he saw a war as being a solution to his desire to annex territory. Now at the time, the boundaries of Texas were ambiguous, especially this part. Polk sent troops into this area at the very least to demonstrate US claims in the region, and likely to provoke a war. Mexico attacked the deployment of troops, and a multi-year war broke out, ending with a resounding defeat for Mexico. Mexico signed a treaty giving up all this land to the United States in exchange for money. So now the US has a lot of new territory, land that would become California, Nevada, Utah, large parts of Arizona, and parts of New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. This might seem like a victory for the US, but it actually resulted in some problems. You see, America was a nation divided by slavery. In the South, slavery was intertwined heavily with the economy and culture. In the North, slavery had been largely rejected, being made illegal by most states many years before. Many Northerners wanted to stop the spread of slavery, both because it was extremely evil and because they saw the Three-Fifths Compromise as giving too much representation to slave states. Many Southerners, on the other hand, sought to expand slavery, to protect the institution of slavery from federal legislation, and because they thought it was their right to bring their supposed property wherever they wished. Now, with this enormous territorial acquisition, there were questions of slavery all over the place. Polk had blazed ahead with empire building, but now the question of slavery was left to his successors. So James K. Polk decided on his own terms to be a one-term president, and in 1848, a new president, Zachary Taylor, was elected to the White House. Taylor was a general who led troops during the Mexican-American War. He had never publicly stated political views before he ran for president, and he'd also never even voted, but became a national hero during the war, and Americans decided that somehow he was qualified to be president. So let's talk about the situation that the 12th president, Zachary Taylor, inherited. Now remember, people back then were very concerned with a balance between slave and free states. Texas was already going to be a slave state. There was no getting around that. Settlers had brought their slaves there, and Texas was a slave-owning nation when it was annexed as a state by the US. The boundaries of Texas, however, were very ambiguous. Different politicians all had different ideas about what the boundaries should look like. California was also definitely going to become a state in the near future. It had actually rebelled against Mexico a mere 25 days before being occupied by the United States during the Mexican-American War. It was huge, and its territory went well into the north and well into the south. Then there was the question of slavery in the rest of the territory. Other parts of the land acquisition from Mexico were not necessarily ready to become states, but the question of slavery needed to be answered nonetheless. Another problem was arising at the same time. Slaves were escaping from southern plantations and finding refuge in northern states, whose governments would protect the former slaves from being recaptured. Southerners were angry that the North was complicit in what they saw as a theft of their property, while the northern governments refused to allow the southern governments to interfere with the livelihoods of those they recognized as free men. These questions threatened to divide the United States, and similar questions actually would in 10 years, but this time, the outcome was different. Ultimately, the legislature was the place where these big questions would be determined. Henry Clay, a well-respected senator at the time, agreed that California should become a free state, but felt that the New Mexico and Utah territories should remain under federal territorial control. He additionally proposed that Texas be paid money to relieve it of its debts, and in exchange, Texas would cease to claim the land that the federal government saw as part of New Mexico. Clay also supported the abolition of the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Finally, and most controversially, he supported a stricter Fugitive Slave Act. Now, there was already a law in place saying that fugitive slaves could be recaptured by their owners, but the proposed new law would impose penalties on those who assisted runaway slaves. As these policies were being debated, talks of secession grew. At one point, Taylor suggested that if Texas did not cease threatening the territory of New Mexico, he personally would lead an army there to stop potential violence. Now, unfortunately for some, less than a year and a half into his presidency, Zachary Taylor died of an unknown illness. A lot of sources mention that he gorged himself on milk and cherries, as if that somehow caused it. His vice president, Millard Fillmore of Buffalo, New York, became the 13th president of the United States. Now, while Zachary Taylor was opposed to Henry Clay's bill, Fillmore quietly supported it. It's interesting to note that the slave-holding Southerner Taylor was more strongly against the expansion of slavery in this situation than the anti-slavery Northerner Fillmore. Despite Fillmore's wishes, however, Clay's bill failed. Another senator, Stephen Douglas, proposed splitting up the bill into 5 separate parts, an idea which Fillmore could get behind. The Senate passed all of the bills with different coalitions for each bill, and they moved on into the House. The House is full of representatives proportionally given to states based on their population, unlike the Senate. Since the North was more populous than the South at the time, the House's sentiments were more anti-slavery than the Senate's. The Fugitive Slave Bill was extremely difficult for the House to pass, but Fillmore urged legislators to abstain from the vote if they found it too objectionable. Finally, after much debate, the bills passed. And there you have it. These bills became law, and the Compromise of 1850 was born. Many people saw this Compromise of 1850 as having saved the Union, including Millard Fillmore himself. Historians disagree on whether or not this is true, and some historians even believe that it contributed to the outbreak of the Civil War of 1861. Ultimately, we'll never really know for certain, and a lot of this is up to interpretation, so I'll leave you to make your decision about the impact of the Compromise of 1850. So I want to get into what inspired me to make this video a little bit. I go to the University at Buffalo, a school that happened to have been founded in part by Millard Fillmore, a key player in the story. Many at the University at Buffalo, or UB, have called for the removal of Fillmore's names from signs and buildings. Specifically, multiple opinion pieces have been published in the school newspaper, the UB Spectrum, on the subject. These opinion pieces all take issue with the signing of the Fugitive Slave Act. The university has decided to remove his name from at least one building as a result of these activists. I wanted to learn more about the subject and decided to make this video. After researching the topic, I personally don't find the signing of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act to justify the universal condemnation of Millard Fillmore, but that's just my opinion, and hopefully this video can help you decide that. There were other criticisms levied, including the fact that he was nominated for president for the anti-Catholic American Party, the fact that he supported Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction efforts, and the accusation that he considered black people to be members of a, quote, wretched race. I couldn't tell from my research whether Fillmore actually said the last criticism, but he may have. The other two criticisms are true. Whether or not Fillmore deserves to be canceled over them, however, is for you to decide. Thanks, and I'll see you next time on the DC show.